Jai Baba. This is the 10th session in our series, God Speaks as the Master Framework for Meher Baba's Darshana. This will be the first of 3 sessions on the 8th part, or the 8th chapter of God Speaks. The 8th chapter is very long. It's about 75 pages. It's longer than the first 7 chapters were together. And it's maybe the deepest and probably the most difficult part of God Speaks. In this slide, I've given a description of what the subject matter that these 3 sessions will be covering. Part 8 of God Speaks, which constitutes almost 2/5 of the main text, constitutes a second pass through the divine theme. But this time, with a special orientation toward what we could call cosmic architecture. Special attention will be devoted to the everything and the nothing, God's triune nature as knowledge, power, bliss, God's 3 aspects as creator, preserver, and destroyer, God's 3 states as wakefulness, dream, and sound sleep, fana and baka, and the spiritual hierarchy. Now, as I've been saying in most of the sessions until now, God Speaks seems to me to be, in its organization, built around the divine theme, which this famous drawing of Rano Gailey illustrates. The divine theme is, of course, the story, the narrative of the journey of the soul from the first awakening with God's wind to the realization of God at the end. Now, the first chapters 2 through 7, which we've dealt with until now, went through the divine theme a first time. And at this stage in chapter 8, Baba starts over again and goes through it again for a second time. But now he does so from a very different point of view, which I'm going to try to explain a little bit right here. In this slide, 3 principles in the analysis of an event, such as creation. I'm trying to explain what this chapter is doing. If you take an event, any event, like, I don't know, a football game or a party or anything, in very crude terms, you could say there are 3 elements in it. One, the first, is the actants, the people who are actually the doers within that. The second, I'm calling the architecture or the environment of action, the scene in which it occurs. The scene could be the physical structure, or it could be, like, suppose a cricket game. The architecture would be the stadium and the rules of cricket, and the audience and the entire environment in which the action occurs. And the third would be the narrative, the storyline. Now, if we were to take creation itself to be an event, the event in question, I'm thinking of the divine theme as the storyline. This is what happens. And the principal actant would be the drop soul, the jivatma, the soul that makes this entire journey. Okay, the architecture is the real special focus and feature, in my understanding, of chapter 8. That is to say, certain cosmic eternal principles in the context of which this journey occurs. I'll be talking about these in depth, but one would be God's nature as knowledge, power, and bliss, or the sound, sleep, dream, and awake states, or God's 3 aspects as creator, preserver, destroyer. You see, these are huge cosmic principles governing the architecture of the entire universe. So in the 8th chapter, the 8th part, as they're called in God Speaks, Baba is telling the story of the divine theme a second time, But now he's not focusing so much on the scale of the individual drop soul as the principal character. That's implicit. But he's looking at the broad framework in which this happens. And so it's like, almost like if you're taking a film of something, the camera is backing way, way off, where the human character is this little tiny dot in a landscape. And now you're looking at the vast scenery in which it happens. In fact, if you were not alerted to it, you might not even altogether be aware that the divine theme is actually structuring chapter 8, because it's not anything like as evident as it was in the first pass, but it is there, very much is there. Okay, so there are two principles in the organization of this chapter I'd like to refer to. One I've just mentioned is the divine theme. And as you know, the divine theme has as its stages, from the original beyond state of God, there's God's creation of creation through the whim or the primal urge, evolution of consciousness, reincarnation, involution, and the realization of God. Chapter 8 follows through that, though it may be rather hard to see at some points. It's definitely there, though. Baba is following through that narrative line, except that he goes beyond just the realization of God in this pass through. Most drop souls, when they realize God, they're finished. They leave and never come back. There are, however, some who have duty in creation. And the name of this particular topic is the 4 journeys. The first journey is from human consciousness to the realization of God. The second is from the realization of God for those few souls, glorious souls with this destiny, back to creation consciousness. These would be Paramhansas or Jivan Muktas in the 9th state of God when we get to that chapter. The third journey is from that state to the assumption of duty as a perfect master, a Sadguru, or Kutub as the term is. There are always 5 on earth. And the 4th journey is when a Sadguru dies and then goes back into the beyond state. So this chapter takes us through all of that also, explaining these different types of God-realized beings. It talks about the spiritual hierarchy. And it culminates in a discussion of the unique and special role of the avatar. So it's a bit broader in its compass from that point of view. So that's on one level. That implicit narrative is running from beginning to end. But in the course of it, Baba takes up a whole series of topics. And now this slide, I think could be very helpful if you're trying to follow how Chapter 8 is organized. Broadly speaking, Baba progresses through a whole series of major themes, more or less in this order. Let me read these out. He begins, of course, the very beginning is the beyond state of God. This is concurrent with his presentation of the divine theme, which begins with the beyond state of God. But among these themes, he begins with an extensive discussion of the everything and the nothing. Now, these would be familiar terms to many Baba lovers because many books bear this title. But I would say the most significant treatment of this topic is in this part of God Speaks, running from, in the 3rd edition, 3rd printing, from about pages 75 to 85, that particular section. Then Baba goes into creation, the whim, and the Om point. This is the beginning of the divine theme. Then Baba explores what he calls the trio, T-R-I-O, meaning threefold, nature of God as knowledge, power, and bliss. Knowledge, power, and bliss. This is a huge topic in Meher Baba's Darshana. And if you really want to understand his Darshana, his cosmology, his philosophy, this is a really big one. It's as big as, say, within Christianity, the Christian Trinity would be. It's really important. Then, actually, there's a lot of back and forth between these different topics. It's not rigidly in this order, but the next topic Baba takes up, again, I'm following through on the items on the slide. The three conscious states of wakefulness, dream, and sound sleep. Now, these are not just psychological states that we go through. These are cosmic principles. You have this in Vedanta also. It's a big theme there. And during the same part of this chapter, we're in about pages, 85 to 100 or so, Baba also delves into God as creator, preserver, and destroyer. In Hinduism, these are Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. Those three aspects. It's one of the most difficult and deepest parts of the whole chapter, and you find out how important this aspect of God is. Much more relevant to us than you might have guessed. Around page 100 or so, Baba gets to the stage of reincarnation in the divine theme, and he says certain things on life and experience in human form. This would be the reincarnationary cycle. After this, about page 113, for a few pages, Baba goes into involution and the journey through the planes, talking about the 7 planes of consciousness. This is, in fact, very close, and a lot of it is even word for word the same as chapter 5, which we already covered in earlier sessions. So when we get there, I'm not going to say all that much about it. Now, in the sections that follow, there are a lot of complex topics that arise. Most of them center around these 2 Sufi terms, as on this slide, of fana and baka. The different kinds of that. Fana means annihilation, and baka means an abiding in. After you pass through an annihilation, you emerge into and abide in to a new state. When you realize God, the first stage of that is annihilation, nirvana, where the entire creation is annihilated for you. And baka follows that, where you abide in what follows. So Baba has a very in-depth discussion of that topic. Throughout this whole section, we're in pages, 120, 130, something like that. Baba starts to talk about the 4 journeys that I mentioned. From human state to God realization, first journey. From God realization to Baka Bila, the Sufi term for it, or Sahaj Samadhi, the Hindu term, which is consciousness of creation. From there to Kutubiyat, or the experience, the duty, assumption of duty as a perfect master. And from there, the dropping of the body of the perfect master, who then takes permanent vacation and goes back to Nirvikalpa Samadhi. The avatar gets no vacation. He always has to come back. But perfect masters, once they've done their job, they retire forever. And the last part of it talks about the spiritual hierarchy. There's an actual hierarchy that governs creation. The different kinds of Shivatmas, that's a term for God-realized personalities, and the avatar. There's a very significant treatment of the avatar with which this chapter concludes. So for those of you who are trying to figure out how on earth this chapter is organized, I suggest the items on the slide could be helpful. Baba is not always rigidly following this sequence. Sometimes he goes back and forth a bit. But broadly speaking, he does move through these topics. Here's something else about chapter 8 before I get into the specifics of it. It's not just very long, it's very unrelieved. it's a continuous, in-depth, concentrated delving into very deep topics. And the prose is, the sentences are very long and very convoluted. There are very few section breaks. There are a few at the beginning, but after that, that's it. So it's hard to read. There's no doubt about it. And in these sessions, I'm not going to be able, in just 3 sessions, to do close readings. It's too much for that. There are a lot of groups, Baba groups around the world, where they do that, where they will go over every paragraph and chew it over and try to understand it. And really speaking, this chapter calls for that. There's no substitute for that. I'm not going to be doing that here, but I'm hopeful that this will be helpful in a completely different way. It will help to show what are the big organizing topics that Baba is going through. If you get those and understand those, I think a lot of this whole chapter will become, a lot of it will open up to you much more. Okay, now the first major topic that I'm going to take up is the everything and the nothing. Baba settled on these as his favored metaphysical terms, you could say, in the domain of, I'm going to use the technical term, ontology. That is to say, what really exists. And I'm going to use the Islamic word from time to time, tawhid. Tawhid is the doctrine that God is one. Now, Baba's tawhid is a little bit different because in Orthodox Islam, God is one, but God is separate from the creation. Not so for Meher Baba. God alone exists, and the creation too is encompassed within God's existence. So that raises the question, if God alone exists, well, how did this whole universe come into apparent existence? What is it? And Baba's metaphysical explanation really centers on these 2 terms, the everything and the nothing. Nowadays, I hear that the word the nothing has become a big philosophical concept in physics and other domains. But for Baba, he started using these terms in the 1920s even. But it was in God Speaks that he really developed it. And so I'm just showing on this slide the very beginning of this whole chapter where he starts to talk about these things. But this slide here, from the everything and the nothing, this diagram, gives a good picture of it. That is to say, God is one and the creation is 0. The entire created universe is the nothing. It does not actually exist at all. It appears, but it is not really there. This is, of course, a close affinity of Meher Baba's Darshana with Advaita Vedanta, the great exponent of which was Shankaracharya, which espouses the same view. So in this diagram, you can see there's the one, which is reality, and there is the 0, which is illusion, which is the appearance of this universe. And on the next pages, I'm going to read a bit from this because it explains in simple terms this theme, which these 10 pages of the chapter 8 in God Speaks develop. Here's another very nice diagram. You can see on the left-hand side, you have the original, real everything. This is God is, right? And within that original, real nothing, everything, you can see in that little circle, the original, real nothing. Now, what Baba kept saying, and God Speaks and in discourses throughout his life, is God is everything, but for everything really to be everything, it has to include nothing as well, right? If nothing were not there, well, it would be left out. So God's everything has to encompass the nothing. In the original state of God, the nothing is latent. In God's sound sleep state, it's unmanifested. But, as you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram, what happens when creation, God creates the universe, which begins with the whim, as we've discussed before, is the nothing manifests as nothingness. Nothingness it's not in this diagram, but it is in God Speaks. Nothingness is the manifestation of nothing as the apparent everything. Here in this chart, it's called the false everything. What is the false everything? Well, just open your eyes and you'll see it. For me, it's this room, it's the people in this room, it's the light from outside, it's sounds, it smells. Everything that I experience is the false everything, which is the manifestation of nothingness, which is the manifestation of nothing that is contained within the everything. So if you can get these ideas, you'll really get a lot of Baba's primordial ontology. God is everything. Everything implicitly contains nothing. Nothing manifests as nothingness, as the false everything which we experience. And what our ignorance consists in is in our taking it to be real. God Speaks does not use the word Maya, but Baba does use the word Maya elsewhere in many places. What Maya consists in is our experiencing what is not real as real. What is not real? It is this false everything. It is everything that we experience from the moment we wake up in the morning until the moment we fall asleep at night. It's all the false everything, which is the nothingness made manifest. And the nothingness, again, is the expression of nothing, which is contained with the everything. So you see, this is Baba's explanation in intellectual terms, how God alone can be real. This is his account of that, of Tawhid in this sense, or of Advaita. God alone is real, but this creation is apparent. The first 10 pages of this chapter of God Speaks, the 8th chapter, develop on this theme more in greater depth than Baba did anywhere else. It's the most important treatment of the everything and the nothing. But I'm going to read a little more from the book, The Everything and the Nothing, which was published in 1963, a few years after God Speaks, because this presents this idea in a very simple way. Right below the diagram we were just looking at, I'll read some of this text. The original real everything is infinite and eternal. Being everything, it accommodates within itself the original real nothing, right? Being everything, the everything has to contain the nothing within itself as a latency. The nothing is the shadow of everything. The substance, and this is a new word Baba is using for the everything, being infinite and eternal, its shadow must also be infinite and eternal. At times, the shadow appears to be small, and at times to stretch into huge shapes, right? Shadows do this, right? If the sun is almost overhead, the shadow is hardly visible at all. If the sun is on the horizon, the shadow is vastly extended. Such is the case with the nothing contained within the everything. But even when it seems to have disappeared, it is still within the substance latently. Okay, now he's gotten to the nothing. Now he's going to talk about the manifestation of the nothing. Out of the nothing contained within the everything is projected infinite and eternal nothingness, the creation or false everything, right? Do you get that idea? Out of the nothing is nothingness, which becomes the false everything. Why is it the false everything? Because we believe in it. We take it to be real and we say it's everything, but it's not. Thus, it's the false everything. The original real everything is one, infinite and eternal. The original real nothing, being in the real everything, is also one, infinite and eternal. But the false everything that is projected from the real everything, comprising innumerable nothings, or all things in creation, is innately and unendingly dual. What does dual mean? Well, we experience duality because there's I-U. Things are separate from each other. Everything is dual. That's because it's the false everything. And now Baba starts talking about these innumerable temporary nothings. And let's go back to this chart, which shows this. You can see the false everything, right? Or innumerable nothings. And you see all those little circles, TN. TN. What that means is temporary nothing. Well, what is a temporary nothing? I'm drinking a glass of water. That's a temporary nothing. I'm seeing certain people. They're temporary nothings because in 2 hours I won't be seeing them anymore. I'm experiencing it as around noon time. That's a temporary nothing. So out of the false everything, innumerable temporary nothings are continuously manifesting. So this is the explanation of this topic in this book, The Nothing and the Everything. Now, when God gets into this, I'm, again, not going to attempt to do close readings because it would take us into 15 sessions instead of just 3. But a lot of what these early pages, maybe I'm here on this slide, page 77, 78, but after this, what Baba is starting to explain is how after the creation, the moment of creation, the whim of God, asking, who am I? After that happens, the nothing starts to get manifested as nothingness. And the individual drop souls, the jivatmas, that's you and me, right? Although this would be evolution, earlier stages, get connected to these temporary nothings through their sanskaras. And they start to experience all this content of nothingness as real. Like if I'm a fish in a pond, for example, my sanskaras have bound me to my body as a fish, and I experience my environment with water and algae, and maybe there's a crocodile wanting to eat me, or a fisherman trying to catch me, or else little fish I want to eat, or whatever it is that fish experience. My link with all these things is made through my sanskaras. And it is through this mechanism that all these illusory bits of nothing are made to appear real. This is the experience of ignorance, whereby nothingness is taken to be everything. That is the primordial ignorance that keeps us bound here. Okay, so I don't know if everyone can follow this basic idea. So we have the everything, the nothing. In fact, let me pull up my slide where I've listed these items. Oops. Yes, just to review this. The everything and the nothing is philosophical terms. Meher Baba made these foundational philosophical terms in God Speaks. Everything is the reality, or God in the beyond state. Nothing is the absolute nothing contained and inherent in the everything. Nothing is the divine vacuum experienced in nirvana. At the end of the spiritual journey, the final fana, or nirvana, is to experience nothing as such. So to review once again these fundamental ideas, the everything and the nothing is philosophical terms. Meher Baba made these foundational philosophical terms, foundational philosophical terms in God Speaks. Okay? So the everything means the reality with a capital R, God in the beyond state. Nothing with a capital N, the absolute nothing contained and inherent in the everything. Nothing is the divine vacuum. Sometimes you'll see this term used there. When you experience the nothing at the end of the divine theme, you have the nirvana state, or the final fana. Nothingness is the false creation manifested out of the nothing. And the false everything, God Speaks doesn't happen to use this term, although it was in the everything and the nothing slide we just looked at. But it would refer to the manifestation of nothingness as apparent but false everythingness. This is the work of ignorance, primal ignorance, or Maya. And I'll come to this last point in a minute. So when you get to these pages of God Speaks in this chapter, I'm going to scroll through some of it, like from this chart here, in these pages 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. What Baba is explaining is evolution from the standpoint of these fundamental concepts. He's not talking about stone and metal and vegetation and worm and fish and bird. He's not talking about those. He doesn't bring up those words. What he's talking about is the progressive manifestation of the nothing as nothingness, and the bondage to it through sanskaras that makes you take it as real. So he covers the process of evolution in this kind of way, in these sections. Much earlier, to go to this slide, this is from the book called In God's Hand, which Baba handwrote probably in 1925. I just want to call your attention to this. You can see on this page, thus from nothingness comes out natural darkness, and unnatural light. In this book, Baba used the terms natural light, natural darkness, and unnatural light. These are four words for the very same thing: the everything, the nothing, the nothingness, and the false everything. So sometimes Baba in the early years would use light and darkness as his metaphysical terms for it. But over the course of time, he settled more and more on the everything and the nothing as his root terms. These are the key terms in Meher Baba's ontology, I would say. Okay, so now I'm going to move very briefly to the next major topic, which is creation, the whim of God, and the Om point. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we had an earlier session that dealt with this in detail. Chapter 2 begins with this. But I wanted to say just a few things. You can see in part 8, you see here the Om point on page 77. That gets its own subheading. And on the very next page, you get the whim, or leher, the whim of God. So here you can see that Baba is returning to the very beginning of the Divine Theme story, and he covers it again. You can see the cause which led the most finite nothing, latent in the infinite everything, right? He's describing it in terms of this pair of terms, the everything and the nothing. He's just talking about it in this language. Causes it to manifest itself as infinite nothingness is the original cause called the cause. The whim of God is the cause of everything. This cause is just nothing, but the whim, or leher, of God. This original whim can be called the first word uttered by God. Who am I? This is how it all begins. Now, what Baba had talked about in this section and in this previous section here, as you can see in this slide on the Om point, everything comes out of the Om point. And Baba uses a very odd term for the Om point. He calls it the most finite everything, with a capital E. Right now, E, everything, is a term for the reality of God, which is infinite. How can it be most finite? Well, he seems to be designating the Om point this way because it is the first emergent within the beyond state of God. The first thing that emerges before any creation is there. Now, the metaphor which Baba often used for God in the original beyond state, God is the everything, is an infinite ocean, right? An unlimited ocean without surface or shore or anything like that. Fine. But now here's the limitation in that metaphor, because the human mind really can't understand this. When I think of an infinite ocean, I think of extension and space going on and on forever, right? Don't you think of it that way? Well, this ocean has no space, so it's really quite unimaginable. So there's nothing like space, there's nothing like time, but in this spaceless, timeless reality of God, suddenly the Om point distinguishes itself. And because there is nothing but everything, the Om point is the most finite everything. You get the idea? It's almost like suddenly a drop within an ocean. Baba also uses the term the most finite everything right in that section for a reference to drops within the ocean. I don't know if you're getting this idea, but it's to express the fact that there is nothing but everything, but now you have a point of finitude. So if you were to ask the question, where is it? Well, there's no where. There's no space yet. It is only because of the Om point that space appears. Once creation has happened, at that juncture you could say, oh, the Om point is there. Baba did sometimes talk about the earth as being the closest, to the Om point. So apparently the Om point does have some kind of a location in space. But originally it did not, because there was nothing like space. Space is a consequence of the Om point. And I think in a deeper, more fundamental way, the Om point is actually everywhere. Or you might say, everywhere and everything is contained within the Om point and manifested out of it. So this is there are many topics in God Speaks. If you want to shatter your brains to pieces because the ideas are incomprehensible, this is a good one to do that on, the nature of the Om point. It's a very good meditation. And the Om point and the whim are affiliated with each other. The whim is expressed through the Om point, the most finite point, and out of that most finite point comes everything. But then Baba says this, that because the Om point is most finite, but because God is inherently infinite, nothing and nothingness keeps expanding towards the infinite, right? You get the idea? At its beginning, the nothingness would be most finite, stone form, electron form, like that. But because the nature of God is infinite, within this medium of nothingness, of shadows, of non-existent, it keeps extending and expanding itself ad infinitum, and there's no end to it. That is why, Baba says in this very section, it is so impossibly difficult to escape from this illusion, because this illusion keeps extending itself and becoming more and more infinite all the time. There's no end to it, because it is a shadow of the infinite. And all of this happens through the very most finite point that individuated and articulated itself within the oceanic oneness of the everything in the very beginning. Okay, and now the last section of this session today, I'm going to open up another huge theme in cosmic architecture. And this is the trinity of knowledge, power, and bliss. Knowledge, power, and bliss. This is central to Meher Baba's Darshana. It has great explanatory power. And as far as I can see, this trinity as such originates with Meher Baba. I haven't seen in other spiritual traditions people talking about knowledge, power, and bliss. Now, sometimes people will say, oh, well, there's Satchidanand. And as a matter of fact, in God Speaks several times, Baba will say, knowledge, power, bliss, parentheses, Satchidanand. But actually, Satchidanand does not mean knowledge, power, bliss. That's the funny thing. Sat means truth or existence, yeah. Chit means consciousness, and Anand means bliss. So truth, consciousness, and bliss. There's no power term there. So this is one of the puzzles that Satchidanand is often used as a synonym for knowledge, power, bliss when it doesn't mean that. And actually, if you go to the glossary of God Speaks, compiled for the second edition, if you look under Sat, it's defined as power. But Sat doesn't mean power at all. Sat is derived from the Sanskrit verb astitva, which means to be, term of being. So this is one of the puzzles. Or let's put it this way. Actually, Balna too was the one who first called my attention to this, that it gets mistranslated. And I think what Bal thought is some of the people, I don't think they really, the Mandali who were translating Baba, weren't focusing in a exacting way on Satchidanand and what exactly it meant. They weren't philosophers, they were disciples of the Lord. So they would say, oh, Baba, oh, you mean Satchidanand, and Baba probably just let it go. This appears from the 1920s on, so I'm just warning you about this term, which actually means something quite different from knowledge, power, bliss. But Baba definitely means it, that knowledge, power, and bliss, those three specifically, are the trio, means threefold, nature of God. And in this section that we were just getting to, he starts to bring it up. What the most important treatment of this topic, knowledge, power, bliss, is right here in this part of God Speaks. So to read from the bottom of this page, the thing that gives infinity to this most finite nothing is God's own latent triune nature of infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, which, by virtue of being the nature of God, obviously pervades the infinitude of the God-is state latently. Naturally, this infinite triune nature also envelops this most finite nothing when latent in the infinity of the everything. Now, I don't know if you get that. The point is, what is it that causes the most finite nothing to go on expanding? It's because of God's triune nature of infinite knowledge, power, and bliss, which is in the everything and therefore pervades the nothing. So when you get the most finite nothing manifesting out of the everything, God, knowledge, power, and bliss are there, and they pervade it and push it to expand toward infinity. It's knowledge, power, and bliss wanting to express themselves that cause the limitations of the jivatma to become bigger and bigger, thus through evolution, more and more complex forms. When we're in human form, we keep wanting to know new things, to exert power over new things, to be happier and happier. This is because God's triune nature wants to express itself in these ways. Here's another place where Baba makes that very same point. On the, here we go. Okay, it's actually the very next page practically. In short, when the most finite nothing gets projected as nothingness through the most finite creation point, which is also in the infinity, pervaded by the infinite triune nature of God, the projection of the most finite nothingness, closely linked with and upheld by the all-pervading infinite triune nature of God, gradually expands ad infinitum and manifests apparently as infinite nothingness or as infinite creation. So this is a very big theme Bob is bringing up. Again, to repeat it, the nature of God is knowledge, power, and bliss. Because it pervades God's everything, it pervades the nothing also. And as soon as nothingness manifests, knowledge, power, and bliss are latently and implicitly there, and their nature is to expand ad infinitum. Thus, God's creatures keep reaching out to know more, to exert more power, and to experience more bliss, ad infinitum. Now, this is really a profound and pervasive theme. This slide here sort of schematizes some of this. Baba says the God's bliss is dependent on his power. This is, I think, in the everything and the nothing. He says this very nicely. God's power is dependent on his knowledge. Thus, we have an order of descent. God exists. God is. The reality is. In fact, there is Erich would read in Mandali Hall a passage where Baba said this. He said, because God is everything, which is Sat, actually, God knows everything, right? If you are everything, you're going to know everything. Because God knows everything, God can do everything. This is power. And because God can do everything, God is infinitely blissful, right? So there's an order of procession from the real existence of God to God's knowledge, to God's power, to God's bliss. The finite shadows of this are the mental sphere, the subtle sphere, and the gross sphere. This is, you see how the cosmos, the structure of the cosmos with mental, subtle, gross, which you'll read about in God Speaks and Discourses and everywhere else if you read Baba's books, they mirror the triune nature of God. So the mental sphere is the shadow of God's knowledge. The subtle sphere with energy and pran, right, is the shadow of God's power. And the gross sphere is the shadow of God's bliss. So let me ramify on that a little bit. So you might say, why are there just three spheres? Why isn't there a fourth sphere? Say a sphere of beauty, and then beyond that, a sphere of glory, and then a sphere of peace. You know, why aren't there 20 spheres? But there are only three. It's because of this triune nature of God, which is real. These really are the three natures of God. So the mental, in fact, we saw earlier in slide, I think, chart 7 in God Speaks, how Baba says that the man in real experiences through the shadow of the Atma, which is the gross body. Through that, he experiences the shadow of Paramatma, which is the gross sphere, right? The sphere or the universe is the shadow of Paramatma, and the body is the shadow of the Atma. Well, thus, God's knowledge has as its universal shadow the mental sphere, and it has as, on the individual scale, our mental body, you see? We have bodies and spheres, so through our minds, we experience the mental sphere. The shadow of God's power is the subtle sphere on the universal scale, and we have, in our own individuality, a subtle body. And the shadow of God's bliss is the gross sphere, and on the individual scale, it's the gross body. So you see, the gross body, subtle body, mental body are the shadows of the Atma, and the gross sphere, mental sphere, subtle sphere, mental sphere are the shadows of Paramatma. You see what a beautiful coherency this is. Baba's cosmology is, I've never seen this before anywhere else. It's a beautiful, coherent account for why we have these three spheres. And you might say, well, why is the mental sphere, in what sense is it a shadow of knowledge? Well, that kind of makes sense, right? It's thinking and feeling, it's mental life. It makes sense that that would be the shadow of God's knowledge, right? Why would the subtle body and subtle sphere be the shadows of God's power? Well, it's the domain of prana, of energy. When you're on that, you can do miracles. Those two make sense. But the third one is the most perhaps puzzling, although it makes great sense to me having thought about it a lot. Why is the gross sphere the shadow of bliss? Well, you see, God's bliss and God's power and God's knowledge are infinite. But when you get into the illusory sphere, they are both in knowledge. It's knowledge and ignorance. Do you know how to get to so-and-so's house? Yes, I know that. Do you know if he'll be there? No, I don't know that. The shadow of knowledge is knowledge and ignorance. The shadow of power is power and powerlessness. Can you get me that cup that's on that table there? Yes, I can do that. And while you're at it, can you bring the refrigerator over here? No, I can't do that. I don't have that power. So it's power and powerlessness. And on bliss, it's happiness and misery. These two are the shadows of God's bliss. And this is now my own thinking on this. Why is the bliss the end of it? Because bliss is the stopper. Once you have bliss, of the three natures of God, I don't know if in India you have this expression, a couch potato. Do you know what a couch potato is? Someone who just sits on a couch like a potato and does nothing, right? That's the end. You say, Well, bliss is the couch potato, because once you've achieved bliss, you don't want to do anything more. That's the goal. Whereas if you have knowledge, you want to know things. If you have power, you want to exercise the power by moving objects around. But once you have bliss, that's the end. So I understand, that's why the gross sphere is the end. It just simply is gross and wants to do nothing. The gross sphere does nothing unless energy acts upon it. So these, do you see what a powerful, coherent, beautiful cosmological account Baba has given here? So through the course of the evolution of consciousness, your gross body develops, and your subtle and mental bodies are starting to develop also ad infinitum. And so this will be the last point I'll make today. And it relates to this chart which summarizes what I've just been talking about. I'm going to read a little bit from page 84, where Baba does make these points somewhat. I think it would be good not to neglect the text altogether. Okay. Pages 84 to 85, Baba talks a lot about this. In man, the seat of the mind is the seat of desires, thoughts, energy, is the seat of force and vigor, and the body, that's the gross body, typifying happiness. He's making the point that the gross is associated with happiness, which is the shadow of bliss, right? Is the seat of happiness and misery. Hence, these desires and thoughts, force and vigor, happiness and misery, right? That's the mental, the subtle, and the gross, are respectively the finite aspects of the limited mind, energy, and body of man. That's mental body, subtle body, and gross body. God's knowledge, power, and bliss are infinite. Our bodies are most finite, but they're connected with those triune aspects of God. Although these aspects of the finite basis of the triple nature of man, mind, energy, and body, typifying happiness, are finite, due to the fact that they are the outcome of manifestation of the most finite nothing, yet these finite aspects of mind, energy, and body demonstrate their capabilities ad infinitum. Right? These are the finite correlates of knowledge, power, bliss as mind, subtle body, gross body. But because they retain their connection with the infinite, they demonstrate themselves and expand forever and forever ad infinitum within the domain of nothingness. They expand to the infinite. This is because each of these finite bases of the triple nature of man, the energy, the mind, and the body, typifying happiness, is closely linked with and upheld by each of the three infinite bases of the triune nature of God. And here you see Satchidanand, which actually doesn't mean this. But anyway, infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. So our mind, our subtle body, and our gross body retain their connections with God's knowledge, God's power, and God's bliss. Our mind, subtle body, and gross body are finite, but power, knowledge, bliss are infinite. And because of this connection, we go on expanding to no end. This is why you can't get out of the creation, because you keep on experiencing the shadows of the triune nature of God within the domain of nothingness. You keep on taking it to be real. I'm going to go to the next page where there's more on this. Infinite power is unbounded and never reduced nor exhausted, whereas finite energy, though linked with infinite power, right? Finite energy, our subtle bodies, they're linked with God's infinite power, is reduced and exhausted because it is only the outcome of the nothing manifested as the finite energy of nothingness. I don't know, do you get this? That is, so we have infinite power, but its shadow as nothing is the finite subtle body, and because of its finitude, we can get tired. Oh, I'm exhausted, I have to go to sleep. That's because we're finite power. If we were infinite power, that would not happen. But there's a link between our finite power and infinite power. Infinite knowledge is eternal, uniform, and all-pervading, and therefore is without a break in its continuity. The limit is, right? That's knowledge with a capital K. The limited mind, that's our mental body, however, though linked with infinite knowledge, is annihilated and made to vanish ultimately because it is the outcome of nothing manifested as the finite mind of nothingness. Because our limited minds are ultimately the manifestation of nothing, they have to get annihilated in the end. That's when we get God realized. Infinite bliss is bliss eternal and continual because it is perpetual. it is without any opposite aspect, right? Bliss doesn't have an opposite, but the shadow does. Happiness, on the other hand, although linked with infinite bliss, is not perpetual, and therefore it has the opposite aspect of misery, right? The reason we're happy and miserable is because these are the shadows of bliss, which has no opposite at all. This explains our individuality as gross body, subtle body, and mental body, as the shadows of bliss, power, and knowledge of God. And through the body, we experience the gross sphere, the subtle sphere, and the mental sphere, which are the shadows of God as Paramatma on that sphere. You see, I think this is an unbelievably beautiful and powerful explanatory account of cosmology, the like of which I have never seen before. And to conclude on this slide, which summarizes all of this, here we have God's nature as, and then knowledge, power, and bliss. Bliss is the stopper because it's the couch potato. Once you get bliss, you just sort of, you're just blissful and you don't want to do anything. That's why most people achieve infinite bliss at mukti, and that's the end.
Okay.
They don't need anything more than that. It's the stopper.
Can I ask? That's
Yeah.
why most of the guys do not become Sadguru.
Right, right.
Because they attain Godhood, bliss, and everything is bliss.
Right.
And they don't need the concept of power or...
Knowledge, yeah. Bliss in its nature is, I'll use the word tamasic. I don't know if you know the word tamas. Yeah.
Tamasic, yeah.
This is the illusory dimension.
Okay.
What is tamas? Sattva, rajas, tamas. This is in Sankhya. Tamas is
Yes.
inert,
Yeah.
lethargic, stupid.
Mm.
Well, bliss is kind of stupid because when you're blissful, you don't want to think about anything. There's nothing to do.
Like your
You just
content.
enjoy the state.
You've got it all. There's no further movement. Bliss ends it. And in the same way, in the descent from the mental to the subtle and the gross as the shadow of bliss, it just sits there and does nothing unless energy acts on it. It is in its nature tamasic. It is in its nature the end.
So now this is the answer why everybody do not become Sadguru.
Yeah. You've got bliss, and that's the purpose, to experience that infinite bliss, right? It's in its nature, bliss is power and knowledge tend to move towards their objects. If I have knowledge, I want to know something in particular. What's that? Oh, that's my shirt hanging from the bar there. What did I just hear? Oh, I just heard a dog barking. Knowledge wants to know something. Power, I've got power. Look, I can just toss this watch up and catch it again. In their nature, they move towards an object. But bliss has no object.
Like knowledge and power is always vibrating.
Yeah,
And bliss is content.
yeah, it's still. It's completely still. Now, infinite knowledge contains the objects of its knowledge. Infinite power, but nonetheless, in their nature, they project something beyond themselves, right? Knowledge expresses itself as power. Power expresses itself as objects. But bliss, there's no object of bliss. Once you're blissful, there's nothing to do. It's in its nature. Thus, I think that's the reason why bliss is the end of the spiritual journey for most people. And this is why the gross is the end of the descent of God. There's no sphere beyond the gross. It's the tamasic couch potato. It just sits there and does nothing. I think this is such a beautiful account of things. So you see these three natures, knowledge, power, bliss. And then the second row, sphere of creation. The shadows of knowledge, power, bliss are, in this slide, mental sphere, subtle sphere, and gross sphere. On the level of the individual, the body of the individual jivatma, mental body, subtle body, and gross body. And now this is an astonishing revelation that we just found out through Tiffin lectures. The three great yogas are linked with this. And now these yogas, Baba talks about them in many places. They won't come up in God Speaks, but if you read the Bhagavad Gita, it's all about this. Gyan Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. The Gyan Marg, the Gyan path, the Karma Marg, and the Bhakti path. Gyan means knowledge, Karma means action, and Bhakti means devotion or love. These are the three great paths, and Baba talks about these all over the place. Well, these are linked in turn with the triune nature of God. That is Gyan, knowledge path, well, that's connected with God's nature as knowledge, right? Makes sense. Karma yoga, well, it's the yoga of action. Well, what is action? It's exercising your power to do things selflessly and for God's sake. So it's linked with God's nature as power. Baba explains this more. He says, the great leaders of the world, like a Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, and now in the bottom row of this table, we have Path to God on the bottom left. And this is something that is not explained in God Speaks, but nonetheless is very relevant to this topic of the triune nature of God. So I wanted to amplify on this for a minute. Here's a chart from Tiffin lectures. You can see here on top the eternal, or Anant, the infinite. And right beneath that, you have the triune nature of God. I just expanded. Did it expand? Okay. You can see knowledge, bliss, and power. Gyan, Anand, and Bhakti. And connected with these, on the bottom, down here on the bottom left, you have the Gyan Marg, or the knowledge path, the Bhakti Marg, or the devotion path, and the Karma Marg, or the action, path of action. And you can see Gyan Marg is connected with God's nature as knowledge, Bhakti Marg is connected with God's nature as bliss, and Karma Marg with power. You see those correlations? So to go back to that earlier table we were looking at, the knowledge, power, and bliss of God have projected paths. So the knowledge, the nature of knowledge is linked to the path of Gyan. The power nature of God is linked to Karma Yoga. And bliss is linked to Bhakti Yoga. Now, what is one of the facts of love is that it's full of bliss and agony, right? If you're 16 and you fall in love with some sweet little girl, oh, she doesn't love me, I'm in agony. Or, oh, I can't wait to marry her, I'm going to be so blissful, right? Bliss and agony are linked to love. Thus, this triune nature of God is fundamentally the basis for the three great paths also. So just again to look at that, the mental sphere, subtle sphere, gross sphere are the big shadows of God's knowledge. Mental body, subtle body, and gross body are the three shadows of the individuality, and the three paths, Gyan, Karma, Bhakti, Marg, are the three paths dependent on this. This is comes up and is presented, is inherent in these 10 pages of this chapter of God Speaks. And it is really one of the great ideas that Avatar Meher Baba gave to this age: knowledge, power, and bliss. So next time we're going to go on from here and talk about sound, sleep, dream, wakefulness as principles in cosmic architecture, creator, preserver, destroyer, and other great topics like this as part of the architecture or scenery environing the great journey to God in the divine theme. Jai Baba.